안녕하세요. It's an honor for me to participate in this conference on Korea's low birth rate. At the same time, I'm very humble about what I may be able to contribute to the discussion of this issue that has such profound implications for Korea. Now, declining birth rate is often viewed through an individual lens, basically how it affects women or how it affects men. The purpose of my talk is to approach the topic of birth rate through the lens of families, basically how families affect and are affected by low birth rate, and whether they can contribute to more effective and efficient solutions. Now, I begin with a caveat. I'm from the United States, which may be the most individualistic nation in human history. So if some of my ideas do not make sense in the Korean context, please disregard them and focus instead on any ideas that might hold promise. I'm going to begin my talk at the end. For 25 years, I've worked closely with state policymakers in a couple dozen states in Wisconsin, conducting family impact seminars to communicate research to them on timely topics that they identify. Recently, I completed a study of 225 state policymakers about how they use research evidence in their decision-making. And much of what I've learned through my research and through my outreach is summarized in the 4th edition of my forthcoming book on family policy. It's 400 pages, and I can summarize it in 10 words. It's possible to build better public policy for families. And today, I'm going to propose that it is possible to increase the birth rate in Korea. Now, is this wishful thinking? Am I a wide-eyed optimist? I like to think of myself as a person who chooses optimism with both eyes wide open to the gravity of the challenge. I'm aware that in 2022, Korea had the lowest fertility rate in the advanced nations at 0.78. I'm aware of the distinct dynamics of declining fertility here in Korea, its magnitude and its duration. Now, fertility in Korea dropped extremely quickly from 6 children per woman in 1960 to 1.3 children per woman in 2012. And this drop is the largest among advanced nations, except for Mexico. And the fertility rate has remained at or below 1.3 for 2 decades. This is the longest duration among advanced nations. So why on earth would I make this audacious claim that Korea can increase its birth rate? Because Korea has amassed an impressive track record of making remarkable achievements on several daunting challenges in the last half century. I have time to mention only 5 today. Korea has arisen from the ashes of war to the 13th largest economy in the world in 2023. Korea's economy grew 800 times, from 2 billion in 1961 to 1.6 trillion in 2023. Impressive. Korean men and women are among the most highly educated in the world. In Korea, 15 to 13, 4-year-olds have the highest rates of post-secondary education among advanced nations. Amazing. Korea has established a generous child allowance for all children, 0 to 6, and Korea rapidly developed a system of early childhood education and care and after-school care that has participation rates on par with the Nordic countries, who are considered avant-garde in family policy. That's remarkable. And South Korea has been recognized as one of the top 3 nations in the world for its handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. South Korea, Germany, and New Zealand were world leaders because of how they implemented comprehensive measures like contact tracing and lockdowns, mandatory face masks, social distancing, and so forth. Extraordinary. And Korea has already taken the first step in building better public policy policymakers are concerned about the persistently low rates and recognize the need for family policy. Family policy officially began in Korea in the early 2000s, and in a couple decades, spending has increased 10 times. That's very promising. I'm proposing that Korea can increase its birth rate because it is the view of the future that is most grounded in the reality of what's happened in the past. Korea has overcome several enormously daunting economic and social challenges, and I think this past performance is the best predictor of future performance. And I'm not the only one who's optimistic about Korea's capacity to increase its birth rates, as you heard this morning. A similarly optimistic conclusion was reached in a 195-page book on Korean policies that was recently published by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. The OECD includes 38 members, nations that are democracies with market economies. What I'm just going to refer to them as advanced nations for ease of presenting today. So the purpose of my talk is to view fertility through the lens of family, which I call a family impact lens. So what is a family impact lens? So let's start by thinking about other familiar lenses. In my close work with policymakers, one of the most common lenses is the economic lens. When policymakers in the United States are thinking about passing a policy or program, they wouldn't think about doing it without asking, what's the economic impact of this policy or program? Another lens that I encounter in policymaking is called the individual lens. So this individual lens focuses on the individual and it blocks out everything else. So typically it looks at impacts on individuals such as men or women, and it's often used by advocacy groups or lobbyists to advance a single focus that's narrow and self-serving, like what's good for me or what's good for my agenda. But policies that focus on the rights of women or men, as often happens, are incomplete without thoughts of the families in which these individuals reside and without thoughts of the roles that these women and men play as spouses and parents and grandparents. So the family impact lens uses a different set of eyeglasses that encourage a wide-angle view that shifts the focus from an individual to a family relationship. And this family impact lens focuses on the commitment of family members to each other and acknowledges all the sharing that occurs within families. And this sharing brings a lifespan perspective that extends from the cradle to the grave in the only social sphere that encompasses multiple generations. And the family impact lens also brings a comprehensive view that focuses on the 5 main functions that families perform for the benefit of their members and the good of society: family formation and economic support, child rearing, caregiving, and partner relationships. And this broader, more comprehensive focus moves us away from a focus on single solutions. So to assess fertility through the family impact lens, we encourage policymakers and professionals to ask, what family outcomes are affected by low fertility? In what ways do families contribute to low fertility? How do policies affect a family's decision about whether to have a child, the family's ability to economically support its members, the family's capacity to care for and educate its members, and so forth? And would involving families in the response result in a more effective and efficient policies and programs? So the family impact lens is a way of thinking that prioritizes families as worthy of public discourse and research and political action. So I'm proposing today that family policies can increase the birth rate in Korea. Is there any scientific evidence on family policy that it can increase fertility? You know, and I think about what happened in Sweden as sort of a natural experiment. Sweden quickly expanded its family policies between the mid-1960s and 1980 And these family policies were unique because they cut the cost of having a child when a parent, usually the mother, stayed home to care for their children. And these Swedish policies were designed to cut costs in two ways. First of all, they filled in for the lost earnings when a mother took time, usually a mother took time off work, by providing a parent leave benefit that was related to earnings. And they also granted parents the right to cut back their work hours from full-time to 75%. And second, the direct costs of raising a child were supported through policies such as a universal, non-taxable amount paid each month for each child. So this helped pay for the cost of food and clothing. And families with children were also eligible for a housing benefit and subsidized child care. Now, interestingly, the effects of Sweden's policies were compared to those of Belgium and France and Germany, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And importantly, they were also compared to the Nordic countries of Denmark, Finland, and Sweden that had expanded their family policies at the same time, but not as generously or extensively or flexibly as Sweden had. So the study compared the fertility rates of women made in the context of these generous family policies compared to earlier times. And the results were striking. Of the 8 countries in the study, Sweden was the only one with stable cohort fertility. Fertility declined in all of the other countries. And also, the spacing between births increased in all of the other countries, but not in Sweden. So very generous family policies appeared to prevent the decline of fertility. Now, let's turn to South Korea. In Korea, having a child is no longer considered an obligation, according to recent studies, but 90% of Koreans aged 15 to 44 do prefer to have a child. 90% prefer to have a child. So what are the barriers to having a first child in South Korea? And what are the barriers to having a second child, as the number of Korean families with 2 children is also falling? So let's turn to what Koreans say in studies for why they don't have a first and second child. Almost 1/3 say an important barrier is housing costs, and another third say the cost of care and education expenses. When Korean women are asked, 20% report the main barrier is the culture of long work hours. And men, too, say that the long work hours make it difficult to benefit work and family. Another barrier is human capital costs. Specifically, women who take a family break from work experience difficulties in returning to work and maintaining career opportunities. When married women in Seoul were asked, about 1/5 reported that they had experienced a cost to their career after taking a break in employment. And about 3/4 of these breaks were for family reasons, for parenting, for birth, for child rearing, and for helping their children, elementary school children, with education. So concerns about the costs of rearing children are occurring at the same time that the Korean labor market is changing. A study published just last month found that traditionally, getting a job and completing a university education were sufficient for Korean men to marry. But no more. Income has now become paramount for marrying and having children. Particularly, the cost of housing has gone up. And the rising importance of income takes on added significance about young people in Korea who face growing uncertainty about employment as they transition into adulthood. So young people face low wages, insecure jobs, and limited access to social protection, which makes them hesitate to marry and start a family. And low-resource men in particular are being left out of the marriage market. And when Korea is compared to other nations, Korea has the second highest share of low-wage workers, and income inequalities are higher on average than in other advanced nations. So what is a barrier to fertility policy? Perhaps the biggest barrier to declining birth rates is the myth of the family bubble. It's all too easy to attribute decisions to what happens inside the family bubble without thinking about what happens outside this bubble affects what happens inside the bubble. It's easy to fall into the trap that fertility policy can be reduced solely to the decisions of people of childbearing age. But even this brief overview of some of the barriers reveals that there's much more at stake, including housing expenses and work hours and education costs, career costs, and job insecurity. And oddly, in the United States, the pandemic helped us burst the myth of this family bubble. One concern that arose in the United States was how the pandemic was affecting social development, because children's social development was being deprived because they no longer had opportunities to interact with their friends and other adult leaders in school and in childcare settings. So this made it obvious that children's development extended beyond the family bubble to societal institutions such as early childhood centers, schools, and neighborhood associations that provide education in sports and arts. So let me quote from a U.S. domestic worker, the president of the U.S. Domestic Workers Alliance. She says, "The dominant idea before the pandemic was that care and caregiving is this personal responsibility to be shouldered by the women in our household. And if we couldn't figure it out, we couldn't manage it, we couldn't afford it, it was a personal failure." But what had ended up happening in the pandemic is that culturally, we realized that we can do the very best we can do everything right, and it's not sufficient because there needs to be infrastructure and a workforce and systems that are required to support something as fundamental to the functioning of society and the economy as care. So one of the most consistent recommendations, I think, of people who write about fertility policy is that comprehensive responses, a comprehensive package of policies will be needed. And I'm going to focus on what some other countries have done to address fertility, especially the barriers mentioned by Korean citizens. And so I'm going to briefly mention a few family policies, a few workplace policies, and education policies, each that I'll look at through the lens of family impact. Now, what family policies can promote fertility? So effective fertility policy requires addressing three of the main barriers that Korean families face: the added cost of raising a child, the loss of earnings after a child is born, and career costs to mothers after taking a break. So one of the main costs of raising a child in Korea is rising housing prices, which are associated with a decline in marriage. But when looked at through a family impact lens, support from extended family is an important part of making housing affordable. Many extended families in Korea are providing housing for their members. In 2020, almost 80% of youth aged 20 to 29 lived with their parents, compared with only about half of youth in other advanced nations. And in a very recent study, the wealth of parents is an important precondition for purchasing a home in Korea. Purchasing a home in Korea positively impacts marriage rates for men and increasingly for women. So public policy may need to step up to support the cost of marriage, and in particular the cost of housing, when extended family cannot afford to do so. And Korean public policy currently spends much less on housing than the average of advanced nations. Now, to address the loss of earnings when a child is born, one policy that's used around the world is family leave. And Sweden has been a leader in family leave, and they fill in for the loss of earnings by providing a parent leave benefit that's based on earnings, and they grant parents the right to cut back their work hours from full to 75% time. Now, Korean parents have access to a year of paid parental leave. And for fathers, Koreans, along with Japan, has the longest entitlement in the world to parental leave. However, in Korea, paid parental leave is taken by only 25% of eligible mothers and 5% of eligible fathers. So how could uptake be increased? Again, I think Korea could draw from the experience of other nations. Korea's leave is slightly longer than other advanced nations, but the payments are lower. So when you take the payment ceilings into account, over time, the average payment for the duration of the leave is only about 31% of parents' previous earnings. So Korean family policy provides a lower payment for a longer period, and what studies show is that a high payment for a shorter period is more effective in increasing fertility. And since the mid-1980s, Sweden has increased the payment in a way that has been shown to encourage the likelihood of a second birth, using what they call a speed premium. So the leave benefits are related to earnings. So the payment level for the second child is often lower than the first child because the mother may have worked part-time or not worked at all. So Sweden has guaranteed that the payment level of the first birth will be what you get for the second birth if the second birth occurs within 30 months, aptly called the speed premium. And effective fertility policy also will address another barrier reported by Korean families, and that's long work hours for parents. Korea has the longest annual number of work hours among advanced nations, which interferes with leave taking among parents who fear it's going to reflect unfavorably on their commitment to their company, and it's going to put undue pressure on their coworkers. Now, these fears were substantiated in part in surveys of over 5,000 Korean corporations about why it's difficult to adopt parental leave. About a third of businesses reported that an employee's absence does put extra pressure on coworkers. And about a third of these corporations reported that it's hard to find substitute workers. And in response, the Ministry of Employment and Labor is operating a substitute worker bank. In 2022, over 1,000 workers received full salary due to parental leave, but the substitute worker bank matched only about 4,000 workers to a business. So the efforts of the bank could be expanded and extended beyond the fields currently covered, which is now public health, public administration, and social services. Now, what workplace policies can promote fertility? Encouraging employers to offer family-friendly workplace policies will take both a carrot and a stick. And in some respects, Korea has already taken the stick approach by requiring firms to disclose the percent of eligible employees who take family leave. And other employer metrics that could be disclosed are the percent of workers who voluntarily work part-time, the number of women who return to a comparable job after taking a career break, and the average hours worked per week, which could be used to assess adherence to the recent regulations limiting work to 52 hours per week. In other domains, such as affirmative action plans, the Ministry of Employment and Labor names and shames workplaces for failing to follow through on these other plans. It's not clear how strictly or consistently these current transparency requirements are being monitored. So the stick's important, obviously, but equally important are carrots that recognize the contributions that businesses make to a prosperous economy. Businesses create jobs, of course, produce wealth, and foster innovations that improve the living standards of society. So an emerging priority for business leaders in every country is corporate social responsibility. Businesses around the world have been applying their resources and their expertise and insights in ways that benefit society. So taking responsible actions that benefit society has contributed to business too, to their reputation, to their attractiveness, to employees, and to their competitive advantage. And this value of corporate social responsibility has emerged in studies in Europe and the United States, in Fortune 500 companies in Iran and Taiwan. And the power of actions that businesses take to demonstrate social responsibility depends on whether they create shared value, value for society and value for business. And according to Harvard Business Review, the closer the value to society is to the value to the business, the more effective it will be. And the greater the opportunity that businesses will be able to apply their influence and their expertise and their resources. For example, Whole Foods sells organic, natural foods to customers who are concerned about healthy foods and the environment. Whole Foods is the only Fortune 500 company that totally offsets its electric consumption through the purchase of wind credits. Its stores are cleaned with environmentally friendly products, and its stores are built with a minimum of raw virgin materials. Now, once again, I applied the lens of family to corporate social responsibility, and companies who are looking to the future will look to families. So in today's knowledge-based economy, every nation's competitiveness depends on its human capital, which is driven largely by the education and social skills of its labor workforce. And productive workers need both hard skills and soft skills. And children's success in school depends to a large extent on socialization that occurs early in family life and in preschool programs. Children's ability to become leaders and to be socially competent in problem-solving situations depends in large part on secure attachment relationships. These are the bonds that infants form with caregivers who are responsive and available. So the ability of business to recruit productive workers depends on families to bear and rear these productive workers. So the debate of fertility policy is short-sighted if it ignores the strong and lasting influence of families on human capital development. So supporting families is one example of corporate social responsibility that creates value for society and the value for business. For example, a business that's a leader in allowing parents to take leave will produce the loyalty that many companies desire, and it will contribute to the productive workers that today's knowledge-based economy really needs. And allowing parents options for part-time or reduced work will contribute to work-family balance and may help businesses offset low labor productivity, which is 48% below that in the United States and well below the average of advanced nations. Could it be, as studies in Korea suggest, that reducing work hours might contribute to higher productivity and more job satisfaction? Businesses that become champions of innovative family supports could be publicly recognized by government, education, and the media. And imagine my surprise when I looked and found the Korean Ministry of Gender Equality and Family has given family-friendly corporate certificates every year since 2008. Yet so far, only about 5,400 corporations have received the certificate, and 20% of them are public organizations. So could its reach and impact be expanded? Could additional points be awarded when they submit a bid to a public procurement service? Could businesses who champion families be more broadly recognized by well-known leaders in Korea, in government, in education, in the media, in even popular culture? Could the stars of that great show, Crash Landing on You, be recruited to bring visibility to businesses who champion families? An effective fertility policy also recognizes the concerns of Korean people about the high cost of private education and helping their children complete a college education and secure a job in a large enterprise. Korean households spend 3 times more on private education for after-school, academic, and private tuition than the average of all advanced nations. But despite these aspirations and expenditures, Korea seems to have a number of youth who face uncertain futures with low wages and few prospects for lifelong jobs. At the same time, there seems to be a mismatch between the skills youth are getting in their education and the demands for skills in the labor force. About a decade ago, policymakers in the United States faced the same dilemma. We had a number of youth who were not succeeding in the labor market. At the same time, the prevailing emphasis was college for all, the idea that all students should go to college. However, the reality was that the majority of our young people did not complete college by their mid-20s, and so many of them were leaving college with a huge debt and without a degree. So we found ourselves at risk of leaving millions of our young people on the sidelines. And policymakers feared this would severely damage our nation's ability to remain competitive in a global economy. So it was clear that we were falling behind industrialized nations in equipping youth for decent jobs, such as construction and manufacturing, carpentry, electricians, law enforcement, pipe fitting, shipbuilding, welding, and many positions in the healthcare industry. Leading corporations like Microsoft and Apple and Costco and Pearson were critical of the United States education system, calling it obsolete and the need of 21st century skills. In response, Bill Simons at Harvard University started leading a national initiative called Pathways to Prosperity that proposed multiple career pathways for youth to succeed, using a rigorous curriculum combined with work-linked learning. So for models, we turned to other countries. We turned to Austria and Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland. And this work-linked learning was incorporated into the traditional educational system using apprenticeships and internships. In Korea, only 6% of 15-year-olds had completed an internship, compared to an average of 27% in advanced democracies, 4 times higher, and 67% in Denmark. So Korea's education of workers with career-related skills trails other advanced nations for several reasons, one being the Confucian emphasis on white-collar over blue-collar jobs. And also, Korea is the only country in the world that relies almost exclusively on private schools to provide work-linked education. So if public resources are devoted to career and work-linked experience, this may require reallocating resources away from four-year colleges. In the United States, this was a very difficult transition. Who knew that Korea's educational sector had an important role to play in increasing fertility by supporting this transition to more career and work-linked education? Now, 2 family impacts are obvious from this work. In the United States, one of the most best-studied and most successful models for combining academic education and work-based learning is career academies. These are small learning communities in secondary school, and they work with local employers to provide work experience in careers like business and finance and health science, high technology, pre-engineering, public service, travel, and tourism. In rigorous evaluations, the annual ratings of the students in the Career Academy group were 16% higher than in the non-treatment group. And 8 years after high school, young students in the Career Academy groups were more likely to be married and living independently with their children. And expanding work-based learning will involve more than just the decisions of young people. It will take parents supporting a career track other than 4 years of college. This was a heavy lift in the United States, but not as heavy a lift as it will be here in a Confucian society. I asked Bill Simons, who is the director of the Harvard Project, how he became interested in alternative career pathways. He told me the interest came from his own family. He had 3 sons, 2 who took the traditional college route, and a third who wanted to become a chef and took the route of career and work-linked education. So it was one of his own children that taught him that you can be happy and succeed in life in career paths other than a 4-year college degree. So implementing a package of policies to address the low fertility rate will require Korean citizens to support new policies. For example, if there's a shift to reduced or part-time work hours, this will challenge Koreans to look at the changes through a family lens rather than an individual lens. If reduced work hours is looked at through an individual lens, it will raise questions about whether an individual worker is getting special treatment. But if reduced hours are looked at through a family lens, it can be viewed as a way that coworkers and companies can support parents in the critically important work they're doing for the nation of raising Korea's birth rate. If changes are made to allow parents a smoother transition back to work after a family break, this will require prioritizing career opportunities, not as a benefit for an individual, but for a benefit to a family like this in a society that needs now more than ever more parents bearing and rearing children. And if more opportunities are provided to combine rigorous classroom education with internships and apprenticeships, youth, parents, and the public could view this through a family lens. These careers are an opportunity for young people to earn the income that will allow them to marry and have children. Now let me draw on an explanation from my country about why supporting these policy changes may be hard. In the United States, we're in the middle of many major changes. We're moving from a majority white country to a minority-dominated country. Many immigrants and women are assuming positions of authority that were once held primarily by white men. And technology is changing faster than many citizens can keep up with. And all of these changes are occurring all at the same time. This has led people to say, whose country is this? And to question whether they belong. And in the words of a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, as a result, there are all these people in America who just don't feel at home in their own country. When you threaten someone's sense of home, it's like stepping on an anthill of red ants. There's nothing that makes people more viscerally angry than a sense that you're taking away my sense of being at home. Of course, I'm not sure whether these policy changes will raise similar concerns in Korea. However, I think it's safe to assume that making these policy changes to increase fertility and generate the popular will to support these policies will not be easy. In sum, I'm proposing that it's possible for South Korea to build the public policy and the popular will to increase its birth rate. Korea has already defied the odds in building one of the world's largest economies, in educating its citizens, in its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and in establishing a remarkable system of child care and after-school care in a short time. I'm proposing that Korea can once become a leader in the world, but this time in addressing low fertility. I believe Korean policymakers will put in place a comprehensive package of family and workplace and education policies, all viewed through the lens of family, how families affect and are affected, and whether our policy solutions would be more effective and efficient if viewed through the lens of families. I expect Korean people will step up to support these promising policies that will encourage the bearing and rearing of children, such as reducing long work hours for parents, easing parents' re-entry into the labor force after a family break, and developing multiple educational pathways for all youth to succeed. I expect the business community and the educational sector will champion the changes needed. And an extensive report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reached a similarly optimistic conclusion about Korea. Once people gain confidence that having children is compatible with work commitments and with family budgets, they actually will have children. But increasing low birth rates will not happen quickly. It will not be easy. But just because it's hard does not mean that it's not worth doing. Korea has met hard challenges before, and Korea can do it again. Korea can become a shining model for how advanced nations can increase their birth rate. 감사합니다.